These are the must-have jigs every woodworker should have in their shop, in my opinion. Some of these are so stupid simple. 2 pieces of plywood, a couple holes. Let's go. First on the list has to be the crosscut sled. The most accurate jig for my shop cutting 90-degree cuts is this crosscut sled. I use it all the time. This is a very simple jig to make. This is my iteration, has handles on it. It's called a safer crosscut sled. First thing you're gonna do is cut 2 3.5-inch pieces and glue those together. This is 3/4-inch plywood that you're using. Make sure it's flat, straight plywood. A decent grade of plywood is recommended here. But you can find those at your local home store. It's usually called sanded birch or something like that. Now once you get those 2 pieces glued up, you're gonna leave those to the side and you're gonna work on the base. The base is literally whatever size tabletop you have on your table saw. So for me, I made mine to fit the saw stop, but you can make these for the job site saws as well. Just depends on your tabletop size. Just make it close to that tabletop size. It should be good to go. From there, you're just gonna cut out a couple of strips that fit in the T-slots of your table saw. So most of them are about 3/4 inches wide, but you wanna make sure those fit. It's best to use hardwood here or the UHMW plastic that you can buy online as well. I use hardwood for mine. All you have to do is set those in your table saw slots, put a little CA glue or fast drying glue, and then set your plywood on top of it. That's gonna match or marry those two together. And from there you can pre-drill and screw those runners into the base to secure it. Just make sure you don't use screws that are too long so it doesn't break the top. Once you have those attached, you're just gonna cut a slot, raise the blade up through there and cut a slot in this plywood. Now don't rip all the way to each end or you'll just cut 2 pieces of plywood in half and you don't have a sled. You just got 2 pieces of plywood. Before I attached the fence, I took a chamfer bit and I went ahead and put a small chamfer on the bottom. That way, on the bottom inside, that way that you don't get any wood dust or chips that clog up the area. From there, I just use a framing square to kind of get this close. We're fixing to square this up using the 5-cut method, but to get it close, that's really all you need to do. Just get it close. On the right side, I went ahead and put a screw in to attach this permanently, but on the left side, I'm just using a quick clamp to hold it in place. Once you get it pretty close using the clamp, I just went ahead and attached that with the screw. Now on my system, after I had the fence done and the slot cut, I went ahead and removed this fence before I got it perfectly square, and I cut these dovetail slots in there. What that's gonna do is let me use these dovetail clamps. That way I will be able to hold small parts as well as have a miter fence that I can add to this sled using the dovetail hardware. You wanna put these dovetail grooves in before you attach the fence so that you can get them to the right spot. That's why it's important to mark where the fence was before you take it off. On this sled, I added the mounts for the handles, and then I cut off any excess from the back that I didn't think was necessary. It's gonna reduce the weight and it's just gonna make it a little more usable. Then I went ahead and attached this back fence. That's gonna give it a place to hold the 2 pieces together when you cut the thing in half. Now what's holding this together is the back fence and the fence closest to you. That way you don't just have 2 pieces of plywood flopping around. Now I'm gonna use the 5-cut method to get this fence as square as humanly possible in my workshop anyway. All you do here is you're taking a piece of scrap wood that's 10 or 12 inches square-ish, and then you're just gonna start making cuts, and you're gonna rotate it a 1/4 turn every cut for 4 cuts. On the 5th cut, when you rotated that 1/4 turn, you're gonna basically cut a slice off of this piece of wood. You'll measure both ends and see how far out of square you are. And there's a 5-cut method calculator that I'll drop in the description that tells you your tolerance and which way you need to move things. In this instance, mine was 0.02 inches out, so I used a feeler gauge to move this 0.02, and that dialed it right in. Do the 5-cut method again just to double check things. And once it's as close as you think you'll ever need it, it's good.
It's good.
Once I got this one dialed in, it was 0.007 of an inch square. That's close enough for me. From there, I'm just gonna use screws on the bottom side to lock this in place to ensure that it never moves. Now all that's left to complete this was to mount the handles as well as put in the T-track on top of the fence. Standard T-track, standard 3/4 inch wide slot. This gives me a place to use a stop block. Now once this is built, I literally never have to build it again. Like it's just, I've had this for well over a year, maybe a couple years, and it's just an essential part of the wood shop that I think every woodworker should have in their shop. Link below to the full build video if you want to build one for yourself, as well as plans available for this project. Next on the list, I think every wood shop should have, especially if you don't have a jointer or if you're building tapered legs, is this. It's just a small piece of plywood. This is one of the simplest jigs you're gonna build. Again, I'm using the match fit system because it works so well, and because I use it on my crosscut sled, I can use it on this, and it just makes everything much easier and more cost effective to keep using the same system.
This isn't?
Again, this is 3/4 inch plywood. You can literally build all of these jigs out of the same sheet of plywood. Cut this about 3, 4, 5 foot long, whatever you want. This one's 3 foot long. This works well for my table saw. All you do is take your dovetail bit and route down the length of this about 2 inches from the end. And then from there, you'll just divide out 5 of these dovetail grooves to go across the grain. This allows you to joint the edges of boards and cut tapers if you need to do that. And it's using the match fit system, so everything's nice and secure in there. You want to be careful and not let the clamp stick out the edge of this because of the way it rides close to that blade. You don't want to hit the blade with one of those clamps. It'll damage your blade. But under normal circumstances, just using it as a jointer, which most people will do, just edge jointing boards, this works awesome. I didn't put a runner on the bottom of mine to run down the slot. I just let it ride against the riving knife basically every time. I've never had any issues with that. You can do the same thing, or if you want it to run on that runner, you can do it just like we did the crosscut sled and install a runner on the bottom to run in your T-slot. The next jig I think you should make, especially if you have a miter saw and you cut small parts, is a miter saw sled. It's not even really a sled, it's more of a faux table to set on top of your miter saw. What this does is give you zero clearance in the back as well as the front, so you can cut those small parts safer and cleaner because it's zero clearance. You're getting less tear out there. All you have to do is measure the width and the depth at 90 degrees and then cut a piece of plywood and or MDF, depending on what you want to use. You can use the same plywood we're using for the other jigs and cut that to size. From there, I cut 2 small strips and glued them under the backside, touching the miter saw on each side, and that's gonna hold that in place left and right. From there, I cut a fence that's about 3 inches tall and just CA glued that to the back to temporarily stick it in place. Next, you want to set the depth setting so that it does not cut all the way through your jig, because you don't want to cut, again, if you cut this in half, then you just have 2 pieces sitting side by side. So I set my depth setting to cut about 1/8 inch deep and just made that cut. Now you can do 45s as well if you do a lot of 45 cuts, but if you just do 90-degree cuts for small parts, then I wouldn't even cut the 45s. What that's gonna do is give you a zero clearance, and it gives you an exact spot where that blade is cutting every single time, so it's much easier to line up your cuts and you'll get the same repetitive cut every time, making things more accurate. And for small parts, this is where this is specifically needed, because if you're trying to cut small parts on a miter saw, if you've ever tried to, you know that the fences don't come close enough together, so when you try to cut that small part, it has a tendency to try to roll back with the blade. I've done this and it scared me. I literally broke my thumb doing it because of the kickback. It's just dangerous and unnecessary when you can build something so simple in about 5 or 10 minutes. This just keeps everything nice and safe. And then if you pair that with a $1 million stick to hold those things down, this is a great way to cut those small parts. Not a lot of people have a hand saw to be able to cut these accurately square and to length every time, so this is one of the better methods I've found. Of course, you could also do this on the crosscut sled, cutting very small parts. But if you're using the miter saw a lot, this would be a handy jig for you. Before we get to this handy little jewel, let me tell you about the planer sled. Now, if you have a planer and you have a board that's twisted, this is the best way I found to get the twist out of that board. Again, very simple. 3/4 inch piece of plywood as wide as your planer is. So in this instance, mine's 13 inches wide. I've got a board that's about 12 inches or so wide. Doesn't have to be exact, just close. And then you're just gonna glue and screw a little strip on one end to keep that from, basically keep the planer from pulling the board off of your sled. The only thing you need to make sure here is that that plywood is nice and straight and flat. Once you have that done, all you have to do is put your board on there, shim it up so that it's not rocking. Once you have it shimmed, you're just gonna run that through the planer. Make sure you run the cleat side, in other words, the board you put on the end first, because that planer is wanting to pull that board that way. Then just run it through until you have the same surface all the way across. This is gonna flatten that one side. From there, you're just gonna flip the board over, start running that through until the other side is parallel to the bottom side. You got 2 parallel sides, and you've removed the twist from that board with a very, very simple jig that anyone can make. I'll show you this jig, but I got one bonus for you if you stick around. Now, this is for the router tail. This is one of the safest, best ways I've ever found to cut across the grain or cut slots or anything like that in your wood. This jig idea was given to me from my friend Mike at TadeTools.com. I highly recommend you check him out. You're gonna take a piece of plywood and cut it 10 inches square. This is 10 inches by 10 inches. Then you just need a piece of plywood that's 2.5 inches tall, 11 inches long. I drilled 2 1.5 inch holes in each corner. That's the jig. Now, if you're using the router table and you're trying to cut basically a narrow piece, cut a groove across that. In this instance, I was trying to cut a dovetail groove across the grain or across the width of the board. This board's only about 3 or 4 inches wide. If you try to do that without this jig, there's no support for it, so there's no way to hold that perfectly square. Now with this jig, you're going to put it up against the fence of your router table, set that distance that you're going to want to cut that groove away from the end, and then this gives that support. It's going to do 2 things. One, it's going to keep it from rocking, and 2, it's going to keep it from tearing out when you finish that cut, because if you don't have anything back there supporting it, a lot of times you'll get blowout or tear out there. This is one of the simplest jigs to make your router table much safer. Now there's a thin rip jig for the table saw that I've recommended multiple times. This is one of the handiest jigs you can have, especially if you're cutting very thin strips. And where this comes in handy for me is if I'm putting trim on, say, like my miter station or even this workbench, and I need to cut thin strips to go around certain things. This is really handy to have. It cuts very accurate, it's very easy to use, and it's not very expensive. I'll drop a link in the description below to all of these builds for step-by-step guides on how to build these jigs, as well as plans available for the ones that I have. I made some awesome featherboard jigs you can check out right there. Clicking the box gets you the big old virtual fist bump, or if you want to watch a crosscut sled build, go ahead and check that out right there.